Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my presentation for Social Ontology 2021. My name is Jack Bissett, and my paper is titled, What is a Social Group? Adjudicating the Plural View and Ritchie's Structural Ontology. I'll begin by very briefly introducing Epstein's formulation of social grounding and grounding models, of which I'm sure many of you are familiar. I will then present Horden and López plural view and Katherine Ritchie's structural ontology of social groups. I'll advance two claims by these accounts. Firstly, that there are theoretical gaps in the plural view which leave it untenable currently as a grounding of social groups, such as the problem of coextensionality and arbitrary groups. And secondly, I will claim the comparative advantages of Ritchie's structural ontology, including its responses to topological reductionism and empty groups, make it a persuasive and cogent grounding of social groups. One of the essential metaphysical concepts of my paper is grounding. As many of you will be aware, in The Ant Trap, Brian Epstein argued that social ontology be divided into two components, grounding and anchoring. Grounding is the condition or conditions upon which something takes on a social status. For example, the fact that this particular £1 coin is British currency is grounded on the condition that this £1 coin is a coin minted by the Royal Mint. Particular grounding conditions such as this one are typically the application of a wider framing principle, which convey the relationship between a set of grounding conditions Y and a grounded fact X of type Z in all possible worlds. Framing principles can be expressed in the form for all X, the fact that X is Y grounds the fact that X is Z. The framing principle work in the earlier example would be for all X, the fact that X is a coin minted by the Royal Mint grounds the fact that X is British currency. And these elements of grounding can be brought together and visualized in the form of grounding models, such as the one on the slide. The first to be counter-analyzed is Horden and López's plural view of social groups. The central thesis of Horden and López's plural view of social groups is that each social group is identical to its members, and therefore a social group is simply a plurality. For instance, according to the plural view, the US Supreme Court is the plurality of the US Supreme Court justices. Thereby, the expression the US Supreme Court is syntactically singular, yet semantically plural. The defining motivation for the plural view is opposition to singularism. Singularism is the treatment of a plural entity, such as a social group, as a single unified thing. Horden and López argue that to maintain that a social group is in some sense identical with its members, it must be accepted that a social group is a plurality, since one thing cannot be identical to many things. In other words, the US Supreme Court is not a singular entity, but a plural entity expressed in a syntactically singular way. They describe these terms as disguised plurals. Whereas the central thesis of Ritchie's structural ontology of social groups is that there are two types of social group, which have different but related constitutive groundings. The first type of social group in Ritchie's account are organized groups, which are the realisations of wholes with internal social structures, for example, a chess club or an academic society. The second type of social group in Ritchie's account are feature groups, which are the realisations of externally constituted nodes that exist in social structures. Quintessential feature groups would include economic classes, racial or ethnic groups, genders, and sexual identities. This account is primarily motivated by what Ritchie describes as the Goldilocks constraint, which holds that an ontology of social groups should include social groups that are consensual and that figure in explanations and should not overgenerate social groups. In other words, not every arbitrary collection of people is a social group. Focusing now just on her grounding of organized groups, Ritchie posits that for an internally structured whole to be an organized group, it must meet the following two conditions. Organized group structures are social structures, and organized group structures require the node occupiers to be people or social creatures, or structured groups of people or social creatures. For example, the International Social Ontology Society is an organized group because it is an internally structured whole, it is a social structure, and its nodes occupied by social beings. That can be expressed in a frame principle such as this one. For an external node in a social structure to constitute a feature group, it must meet three requirements. The feature must be defined, at least in part, in terms of social factors. It must restrict occupation to people or social creatures. And it must allow for multiple occupiers at a time in the world. Here would be two quintessential examples, women as a feature group and queer as a feature group. This paper's first claim is that there are theoretical gaps in the plural view as it is currently formulated, which leave it untenable as a grounding of social groups. This will be demonstrated through an analysis of Horden and López's responses to a number of important objections. Horden and López claim that the reason why the plural view is so often overlooked by social metaphysicians is the false perception that has been refuted by at least one of two standard objections. The first sound objection is changes in group membership, and the second sound objection is coextensional social groups. While this paper finds the response to the first sound objection to be fairly unproblematic, this paper takes issue with the response to the second sound objection. The second sound objection to the plural view holds that multiple distinct social groups can contain identical members, i.e. be coextensional, while there cannot be two distinct pluralities with identical members, since pluralities are nothing over and above the members themselves. For example, imagine that all the members of a book club formed a maths club, and no one else joined that club. Despite having identical members, the book club and the maths club would be distinct, yet coextensional, since they operate at different times, possess different powers and structures, and might even behave in different or contradictory ways. However, the corresponding pluralities of the book club and maths club are not distinct. They are entirely identical, because the plurality is simply the set of group members. Thus, since distinct social groups can be coextensional and pluralities can't, social groups are not entirely reducible to the plurality of their members. In response to the second sound objection, Horden, López, Bissett denied that social groups can contain the same members, distinct social groups that is, and argue instead that in such cases there is one social group occupying multiple abstract social roles. For instance, the social group consisting of David, Laura, and Kyle might at certain times occupy the role of the social group, and at other times the maths club. The plural view holds that if both the book club and maths club contain the same members, and they are currently active in the capacity of the maths club, then it would be both true and appropriate to say that the maths club is currently active, while it would be true but misleading to say the book club is currently active. The last case would be misleading because the implication is that they're currently active in the capacity of the book club, when in fact they're active as a maths club. Horden, López, Bissett's response depends upon the identification of social groups with the plurality of their members, rather than the abstract entity of the social group, because if we identified social groups with the abstract entity, like the book club, for instance, then it would not be true to say that the book club is active when in fact the maths club is active. In this way, to justify their claim that to describe a social group as another coextensive social group would be true, even if it's inappropriate, they rely on the identification of social groups with pluralities, which is somewhat circular, since that social groups are pluralities is the claim in contention. And furthermore, they claim that our everyday use of social group terms primarily concerns particular groups, as in the pluralities, rather than social roles. But, as Horden and López themselves state, in cases where two distinct social groups contain the same members, it would be inappropriate to describe one group as the other. What this inappropriateness indicates is that Horden and López at least require further justification for their assertion that social group terms refer to the particular plurality of members as opposed to the abstract social organization. The second objection to the problem of arbitrary groups, the second objection is the problem of arbitrary groups. An arbitrary group is an unstructured set of random and related people. For example, the set containing person A, person B, and person C is an arbitrary group because there is no correlation or relationship between the members. The plural view, in positing that social groups are nothing more than pluralities or flexible pluralities, encounters arbitrary groups as a problem because a random assortment of people can seemingly form a plurality, but we would not necessarily hold that this would be a social group. A grounding of social groups, in the same way as Ritchie argued with the Goldilocks constraint, should be able to meaningfully demarcate a social group from a non-social group, like an arbitrary group. Horden, López, Bissett's initial response to the problem, Horden, López, Bissett's initial response to the problem is that the plural view is officially silent on which pluralities count as social groups. But despite this, they go on to provide a couple of reasonable answers. The first response they give is that we ourselves be content to give a very liberal answer. Every plurality of people is always a social group. It's just that some pluralities of people at certain times and spoken of in certain contexts are more salient or theoretically relevant than others. And there are a number of compatible criteria which could be applied to distinguish significant from insignificant social groups. The second possible answer they suggest is that not all pluralities are social groups, and that this position is compatible with a number of alternative groundings of social groups. For example, they suggest that you could follow Thomason in treating the conditions by which a social group is classified as a social group as particular to its relevant theoretical purpose. And if you disagree with that perspective and believe that social imposes a very definite restriction on groups of people, they said this too would be consistent with the plural view. The problem with the first response is that in conceding that arbitrary collections of people are social groups, the plural view fails to resolve the problem of arbitrary groups. The plural view makes the substantial concession that it's unable to demarcate a social group from a random assortment of people, and thereby does not successfully provide a robust grounding of social groups. While the problem with the second response is that it reduces the central thesis of the plural view from social groups are simply the plurality of their members to social groups are simply pluralities, amongst other things. The latter claim is so significantly weaker than the former that it's almost trivial. There are very few grounding of social groups which would assert that a social group does not contain the plurality or the potential for a plurality, while the claim that social groups simply are pluralities is heavily contested. Ultimately, the first approach is taken, the plural view is unable to resolve the problem of arbitrary groups, and if the second approach is taken, the plural view is reduced to the assertion that social groups contain pluralities, and therefore the plural view requires further argumentation and justification to respond to these significant criticisms. This paper's second claim is that the comparative advantages of Ritchie's structural ontology make it a persuasive and cogent grounding of social groups. This will be demonstrated in two ways. Firstly, by demonstrating that Ritchie's account can resolve the most prominent formulation of typological reductionism, and secondly, by defending the non-spatial parts response to the problem of empty groups. So a common objection, which has been mounted by Epstein and Thomason to Ritchie's grounding of social groups, is that it is guilty of typological reductionism, meaning that the proposition that social groups can be divided into two types is unsuccessful, either because the distinction it draws between them is arbitrary, or because it is exclusionary of particular groups. One proponent of this is Epstein, who argues that it's unclear whether organised and feature groups are truly distinct, and that the division between them begins to disintegrate when structural ontology is pressed on how it understands the notion of feature. Epstein highlights that Ritchie needs to clarify which sorts of features members possess count for feature groups and which are ruled out. If the conception is too broad, such that it includes extrinsic features, then it might be possible that all groups can be classified as feature groups, which removes the contrast. While if the conception is too narrow and restrictive, such that it only includes intrinsic features, then quintessential feature groups, such as races and genders, would be excluded. The pivotal challenge faced by Ritchie's structural ontology is thus to clarify the distinction between organised and feature groups in such a way that is neither so restrictive that it excludes groups that are typically held to be categorized in one way or the other, nor so open that the distinction breaks down. While in previous papers, Ritchie has permitted a degree of deliberate ambiguity in her demarcation of features, presenting multiple possible interpretations of socially constructed properties, which one might adopt or adopt in some combination of in the analyses of feature groups. In her most recent 2020 paper, Ritchie articulates feature groups in such a way that meets Epstein's critique. She posits that feature groups are a particular class of social kind. Feature groups are externally structured nodes in social structures that are either intuitive or that feature in causal or other explanations, defined at least in part in terms of social factors exclusively occupied by people or social creatures and allow for multiple occupiers. This explanation resolves this particular form of typological reductionism because it's inclusive of all quintessential feature groups, has a clearly delineated boundary from organized groups, and is able to exclude feature groups where the feature is neither intuitive nor appears in explanations, or is not defined in terms of social factors or exclusively occupied by social beings. And therefore, this paper finds that her use of a typological approach in her account is adequately justified, since it does not appear to lead to an under or overgeneration of social groups of any particular variety. In his article, There Are No Empty Groups, David Strohmeyer draws attention to an important objection faced by mereological ontologies to social groups, the problem of empty groups or groups without parts. Mereological ontologies, such as Ritchie's, assert that that social groups are wholes composed of material parts, and asserts that members are parts of their respective groups. It follows from this that if something has no parts, such as an empty group, then it can't be a social group. However, numerous social metaphysicians have claimed that social groups can persist without parts. For instance, Brian Epstein has argued that the US Supreme Court would exist if all serving judges simultaneously resigned, and Barry Smith suggests that material parts are not a necessary requirement for corporations. Therefore, since social groups can exist without parts, it is not the case that social groups can be understood as wholes composed of material parts, and mereological approaches to social group ontology fail. Strohmeyer anticipates that non-extensional accounts, such as Ritchie's, which hold that social groups are not solely individuated by the material parts, but also other features, such as structure, could respond to the objection by arguing that there are non-spatial parts of social groups which explain their persistence in the absence of members. For example, an ontological structuralist about social groups could explain the persistence of the US Supreme Court in the absence of any membership by reference to its internal structure. However, Strohmeyer claims that the non-spatial parts response is inadequate because it entails two undesirable commitments. Firstly, it requires that one accepts that social group structures can be instantiated in the absence of membership, which is counterintuitive. And secondly, that in positing partial spatiality, the groups are proposed to be only sometimes in space when they exist. This count of social groups becomes asynchronous with the properties of material objects, and thereby relinquishes the possibility of a unified ontological account of the physical and social world. Finding the non-spatial parts response to be unsuccessful, Stromer proposes his own solution to the problem of empty groups, to claim that groups without material parts do not exist. Stromer begins by proposing a distinction between abstract social objects, like the presidency, and the particular material objects instantiating them, such as the president. From this, he argues that so-called empty groups are in fact abstract objects which become instantiated whereupon they gain material parts. Therefore, there are no empty groups, and the objection fails. A group only exists at time t if it has material part at time t. This paper agrees with Stromer that it is necessary to distinguish abstract social objects from material objects that instantiate them. But on the contrary, asserts that what is typically designated as a social group is not necessarily the contingent instantiating parts, but the abstract object itself. Stromer considers this possibility, asking why not just analyze groups as abstract objects, but implies that while this might be possible in the case of certain groups, such as the US Supreme Court, there are groups for which their material instantiation of physicality seems intrinsic to their nature, such as a dance troupe or military unit. But against this paper contends that if the structure individuating an organized dance troupe was removed, as in the relationship between the members, the team, and dancing, it would no longer be that dance troupe. However, if the dance is removed from the dance troupe, the troupe would still exist, but it would be in an inactive, dormant, or uninstantiated state. The significance of this is that even in social groups whose physicality seems central to their existence, it still makes sense to understand them as abstract objects. And therefore, since social groups as abstract objects are understood to be able to exist through periods of inactivity due to structural continuity, Stromer's argument against the existence of empty groups fails. This conclusion, though, means a return to the non-spatial parts response to the problem of empty groups, which posits that social groups persist through the absence of material parts due to the presence of non-spatial parts, such as structure. And that prompts a reconsideration of Stromer's two aforementioned objections to the solution. His first response was to highlight that the possibility that social groups can be instantiated without members is highly counterintuitive. But in reply to this, even if it is accepted that social group is uninstantiated without material parts, that does not necessarily entail that uninstantiated social groups cease to exist. Empty structures, inactive in all senses, can exist without material realization, and then become reinstantiated at a later date, as has happened with many different organizations. In other words, uninstantiated social groups can exist at time t without material parts at time t by virtue of the persistence of non-spatial parts. Secondly, Stromer holds that granting social groups partial spatiality, meaning they can have a spatial location at some times, not others, forgoes the possibility of having consistent ontology between the social and physical world. But contrary to this paper asserts there are good reasons to expect an ontological divergence between the physical and social world, since social facts and social objects hold a distinctly mind-dependent and intersubjective origin. It then follows that it is at least plausible that they could possess distinct ontological properties to phenomena of the material world. And therefore, Ritchie's structural ontology is well suited to respond to the problem of empty groups following the non-spatial parts route. In the absence of membership, such groups exist in an uninstantiated state as non-spatial structures. Thank you so much for listening. Any questions?